The sky above the Granger Valley Ski Resort carried the muted glow of early winter, that kind of pale, heavy light that makes the snow look almost blue. On that Saturday morning, Silas and Elara Granger walked through the crunch of freshly groomed powder toward the lift line, their boots leaving deep impressions that would be gone within the hour. They had checked into the mountain lodge the night before, their weekend bags still in their room, the trip planned as a quiet escape before the holidays. Silas, tall and broad-shouldered, had his arm draped around Elara's back, pulling her close against the cold. She wore a cream scarf wrapped twice around her neck, one her grandmother had knitted, and a dark green parka zipped to the chin. A pair of ski goggles rested against her forehead, unused. The weather was calm, a thin wind curling off the peaks, fine flakes drifting like dust motes. The lift attendant remembered them smiling, handing over their tickets without hurry. Security footage later showed them stepping onto chair number 47 just before 10:18 a.m., settling in as the bar came down. They were headed for the Summit Trail, a scenic ridge walk popular with hikers even in the cold months. Neither carried skis, just a day pack and a thermos in Silas's gloved hands. The chairlift clattered forward, cables humming. To their right, the forest fell away sharply into a frozen ravine. To the left, rocky outcrops broke through the snow, marked by the occasional black pine. Midway up the line, the slope steepened, and the lift passed over an open stretch where the wind cut sharper. According to later interviews, no one behind them noticed anything unusual. No shouts, no struggle, no sudden movement. Chair 47 simply continued upward until it passed out of view. At the summit station, operators waited for the usual dismount. Chairs arrived one by one, 45, 46, then 4, 8. The seat from which Silas and Elara had boarded never arrived. Operators paused the line, checked the approach cameras, then called down to the base. Staff assumed the couple had gotten off at one of the midline maintenance platforms, something discouraged but not impossible. Still, when a sweep team checked the only platform along that stretch, it was empty. By noon, their absence drew concern. Their lodge room was untouched, the bed neatly made, their personal items laid out, toiletries, extra gloves, a paperback novel, a half-empty bag of trail mix. The day packs they'd been seen with were missing. The resort's search and rescue team was mobilized before dusk. Trained skiers traced every accessible route down from the lift, marking tracks with flags. Snowshoe patrols moved into the tree line, calling their names. A helicopter circled at low altitude until fading light forced it back. There were no signs, no footprints straying from marked paths, no dropped items, no evidence of an accident. By nightfall, the chairlift line hung still and silent, the wind whispering through its towers. Somewhere between the base and the summit, Silas and Elara Granger had vanished, as if the white expanse of the mountain had swallowed them whole. The second morning after Silas and Elara vanished, the resort awoke to a quiet unease. The chairlift where they'd last been seen sat motionless, its seats rocking slightly in the cold breeze. Patrol crews gathered early in the lodge conference room, a map of the mountain spread across the table. Coffee steamed in paper cups, radios crackled, boots squeaked against the wet floor as people came in from the cold. Lead Ranger Peter Holbrook stood at the head of the table, tracing a gloved finger along the line of the lift route. "We've got about a 3-hour window before visibility drops. We'll focus here." He tapped the section bet. "Ween Towers 5 and 7. This is the last stretch where anyone saw them." His voice was clipped, but there was an edge of frustration. In his 30 years on the mountain, no one had simply vanished from a chairlift. The search began in earnest. At first light, the mountain hummed with activity, snowmobiles groaning up service trails, ski patrol teams fanning out on both sides of the lift. They wore bright orange vests that stood out starkly against the white expanse. Radios buzzed constantly, updates on grid sweeps, requests for extra rope lines, calls to check ravines and creek beds. Down in the valley, the Grangers' families had arrived. Silas's younger brother, Michael, stood in the lodge parking lot, staring up at the chairlift line through a wall of falling snow. Elara's mother, shoulders hunched in a long wool coat, clutched a photograph of her daughter and son-in-law, taken just weeks before. Neither could comprehend how two experienced hikers could disappear from a monitored mechanical route. By mid-morning, searchers reported back. No broken branches, no gear left behind, no drag marks in the snow. One patrolman swore he'd found faint impressions near a boulder below Tower 6, the kind you might see if someone had dropped from above. But drifting snow had already blurred them beyond recognition. Holbrook ordered the area flagged for further inspection. The lift itself underwent a technical inspection. Maintenance crews examined every chair, clamp, and cable junction, starting with number 47. But 47 wasn't there. The seat numbers jumped from 46 to 48 without interruption. It wasn't unheard of for a chair to be removed for repairs. But there had been no work orders, no logs of removal. The discovery sent a chill through the investigation. How could an entire seat disappear without someone noticing in real time? Resort security began reviewing camera footage from both the base and summit stations. Grainy black and white images showed Silas and Elara boarding, the bar coming down. Then static. A momentary disruption in the feed, less than 3 seconds, before the camera came back online. The seat in frame was empty. Holbrook had the footage replayed again and again, pausing, zooming, searching for anything in the snowy blur that might explain the gap. By afternoon, the search expanded beyond the immediate lift corridor. Teams moved into the denser pines at the mountain's base, following the frozen creek upstream. Helicopters returned, this time equipped with infrared sensors to detect heat signatures beneath the snow. The screens stayed dark. Reporters began arriving from the nearby city, their vans parked in a crooked row by the lodge. One station interviewed a snowboarder who had been riding the lift that morning, 2 chairs behind the Grangers. "It was quiet," he said, pulling at the frayed cuff of his glove. "Just the wind. Then I heard this sound, like metal on metal. I looked up, but the light was weird, you know? Everything was just white. I figured it was the cable." Theories began circulating before the sun set. Some whispered about a mechanical failure, a clamp coming loose, the seat swinging violently enough to throw them. Others spoke of something stranger, a deliberate act, someone intercepting the chair mid-route. Holbrook, pragmatic to the core, refused to comment on speculation. But even he couldn't shake the oddity of the missing seat. That night, the lodge bar stayed nearly empty. Staff avoided speaking about the disappearance in front of guests, but the air was heavy with it. In the corner, Michael Granger sat with Elara's mother, their untouched drinks sweating onto the table. Outside, the mountain loomed, its lift towers lit in a pale orange glow that seemed to reach into nothing. The next day brought no new discoveries. Snow fell harder now, erasing more of the terrain. Theories hardened into rumors, a hidden drop point under the lift, a rogue climber who'd lashed the chair to the tower and hauled them off. One elderly local spoke quietly about the cable ghosts, a decades-old story about people who vanished while riding at night, their chairs found swinging empty over the black forest below. For the first time in the resort's history, the Granger Valley lift line was shut down indefinitely. Chair number 47 was officially listed as missing. Search teams scaled back to skeleton crews, the weather now too volatile for safe operation. Still, Holbrook left a small team patrolling the lift route daily, hoping the snow might give something back. It never did. By the 3rd week, the official search was declared over. The case shifted from rescue to investigation, its file growing thicker with interviews, lift schematics, and weather reports. The families returned home reluctantly, leaving the mountain quieter than it had been in years. Tourists returned, riding the same lift line, looking down at the white stretch of forest where Silas and Elara had last been seen. None of them knew, or perhaps believed, that somewhere along that silent line, an entire chair had vanished into thin air. Winter on Granger Valley Mountain stretched on with a slow, oppressive weight. The disappearance of Silas and Elara faded from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies and seasonal weather alerts. But for the locals, and especially for Peter Holbrook, the empty chair on the lift line remained an open wound. The resort quietly reopened the route in late March. New signage marked the stretch between Towers 5 and 7. Do not swing or stand on the chairs. Keep safety bars down. Tourists obeyed mostly, though a few took photos of themselves riding past the spot, posting captions like, "The haunted lift," or "Where the couple disappeared." Some skiers claimed the lift slowed unnaturally between the towers, as if out of respect for the gap in its history. Holbrook kept the investigation alive in his own way. On off hours, he hiked sections of the route with a metal detector, scanning for anything that might have fall. Lend from the couple, a phone, a key, a piece of jewelry. He found nothing. The snow had a way of swallowing secrets, and this winter had been particularly heavy. Michael Granger, Silas's brother, refused to let the case go cold entirely. He printed flyers, missing Silas and Elara Granger, and mailed them to ski lodges across the state. He set up a website cataloging every known detail, from the last confirmed sighting on the base station camera to the unexplained static in the lift footage. At first, visitors trickled in. A year later, the site averaged fewer than a dozen hits a month. Then, nearly 10 months after the disappearance, something unusual happened. It was late January, during one of the coldest weeks of the season. The resort had contracted a small drone filming company to produce a promotional video for their social media. The idea was simple: sweeping shots of the lift line, cabins, and powdery slopes. The pilot, a young man named Trevor Blake, launched the drone from a ridge near Tower 8. He guided it down the line, his monitor displaying the live feed in sharp clarity. Midway between Towers 6 and 7, the drone's altitude shifted slightly, giving Trevor a better angle of the cable. That's when he saw it. Something dangling beneath the steel, just out of view from the chairs above. At first he thought it was a piece of maintenance equipment, maybe a safety harness or a rope left behind by workers. But as he steered the drone closer, the shape resolved into something stranger. It was a black mountaineering harness, not new but not rotted beyond recognition. The straps hung loose, twisting in the wind. From the harness dangled a small object. Bright against the dull gray strap, a red metal thermos, its paint chipped in several places. Trevor slowed the drone, circling. The harness was tangled around one of the small service pulleys that ran parallel to the main lift cable. It looked as though it had been there a long time. Ice crusted its seams, and frayed fabric whipped in the wind. But the strangest part wasn't the harness itself. It was what hung just above it. There, hooked awkwardly over the pulley's support bracket, was a length of steel cable no thicker than a finger. It wasn't part of the lift. Holbrook would later describe it as something you'd use to lower gear off the side of a cliff. It wound upward toward the tower, disappearing into the tangle of service beams. Trevor brought the drone back to base and showed the footage to Holbrook immediately. Within the hour, the lift was shut down again. A small maintenance crew, roped in for safety, scaled Tower 7 and began the delicate process of retrieving the harness. When they brought it down, the details became clearer. The harness bore the faint stitched initials EG on the inside waistband, Elara Granger's. The red thermos, once washed of ice, revealed an engraved message on its underside. To E, keep warm out there. Love, S. It was the first confirmed physical evidence from the couple since their disappearance. News spread fast. Television crews returned, this time braving the biting wind to film Holbrook holding the harness at the base of the lift. Michael Granger appeared on local radio, his voice tight with emotion. "It's proof," he said. "Proof they were still on the lift when something happened. Now we just have to find out what." But if the harness offered answers, it also raised more questions. How had it gotten tangled around the pulley? Why was it attached to a cable that didn't belong to the lift? And most unsettling of all, where was the rest of the gear? In the days that followed, investigators rappelled sections of the towers and scanned the tree line below with ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing more. No footprints, no other items, no trace of a chair or bodies. The harness seemed to exist in isolation, a fragment of a much larger event. Privately, Holbrook admitted something had begun gnawing at him. The lift operator, who'd been on duty that morning in January '87, a man named Carl Peters, had quietly told him about a noise he'd heard that day. "Like a winch," Carl had said. "Not ours. A different pitch. Came from near Tower 6 just before the cameras flickered." Holbrook didn't put it in the official report. Not yet. He wanted more evidence. But late one night, after the crews had gone home and the lift line stood silent under the stars, he walked the frozen path beneath Towers 5 through 7, The wind whistled through the steel like a low moan. Somewhere far above, the service cable still creaked, as though remembering the weight it had once carried. What neither Holbrook nor Michael knew then was that Trevor's drone had captured more than the harness. In the background of one slow pan, the camera had briefly caught a shadow, not a person, not quite an object, but something protruding from the cliff face far beyond the lift. At first glance it looked like rock, but under certain light it glinted. Trevor hadn't noticed, not yet. Trevor Blake didn't think much of the footage after handing it over to Holbrook. His job had been to shoot the resort promo, not solve a decade-old mystery. But the story of the harness spread like wildfire online, and Trevor's email inbox began to fill with requests from amateur sleuths, conspiracy bloggers, and true crime YouTubers asking if they could review his original raw files. At first he ignored them. Then one late night, curiosity got the better of him. He pulled the drone's memory card from its case and loaded it into his laptop. The screen lit up with frozen winter mountains, the lift line cutting a neat diagonal through the landscape. He scrubbed through the harness sequence again, slowing the footage to quarter speed. That's when he saw it, the thing he'd missed. In the far distance, beyond the tree-lee, neon cliffs, something stuck out from the rock face. It was faint, washed out in the drone's exposure, but unmistakable. A metallic edge catching the low winter sun. Trevor leaned closer to the screen. The object was partially embedded in the cliff, angled downward as though it had been jammed there by force. It reminded him of the curved strut of a chairlift seat. But this was too far from the lift's line. Way too far. He replayed the clip several times, then exported a still image. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it gnawed at him. By the next morning, Holbrook had the still printed out on his desk. He studied it with a magnifying glass, tracing the contour of the shiny surface. "If that's what I think it is," he said quietly, "then the chair didn't just fall. It was pulled." Within 2 days, a small search and recovery team was assembled. 3 mountain rescue climbers, Holbrook, and a sheriff's deputy named Mara Ellis. The climb to the location wasn't easy. Sheer walls of frozen stone loomed over a gulch that dropped hundreds of feet to jagged rock. Ice made every foothold treacherous. They reached the ledge by mid-afternoon. The metallic glint was clearer now, a twisted section of steel frame, tangled with weathered rope. Holbrook's stomach turned. This wasn't standard ski lift equipment. It was the rear support bar of a mountaineering basket, the kind used to transport injured skiers or cargo. Mara took photos while the climbers secured the object. One of them, a man named Jonas, traced the rope back along the ledge until it disappeared into a narrow vertical crevice. "This goes somewhere," he called over his shoulder. Holbrook crawled over and peered into the opening. It wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet across, but it dropped into darkness. He felt the faint draft of air rising from below. Jonas shone a flashlight down. The beam revealed a faint shape just a few meters inside, fabric, pale against the dark stone. Jonas reached down with his gloved hand and pulled. What came out was a torn section of canvas, stiff-wit, with age and exposure. Printed on one side were faded black letters, Granger. Mara's breath caught. "It's theirs." The fragment was from a duffel bag, the kind Silas had been seen carrying in the last known photo of him boarding the lift. The find added weight to a growing suspicion. Whatever had happened to the Grangers hadn't been an accident. Back at the base, Holbrook logged the new evidence. The fragment joined the harness and thermos in the secure storage cabinet, but privately the sheriff's office began to consider an unsettling possibility that someone had used the lift's service infrastructure to remove the couple from the line mid-ride. Why, and how had no one seen it? The investigation's next phase turned digital. Trevor's full-resolution drone footage was handed to a state forensic lab where image enhancement specialists spent hours isolating background anomalies. One frame, captured just seconds before the harness came into view, showed the faint outline of a human figure standing on a ledge near the pulley system. The outline was blurry, possibly a trick of light, but its placement was exactly where the service cable from the harness had originated. The figure's stance suggested they were braced against the wind, one arm extended toward the pulley. The lab technicians couldn't determine the figure's identity, but the timestamp matched the lift's operational log from the day of the disappearance almost perfectly. Holbrook felt the hair rise on his neck. Whoever it was, they had been up there the same moment the Grangers vanished. Mara Ellis pushed for a re-examination of old witness statements from that week. She found one overlooked note in the original report. A tourist who'd claimed to hear a metallic clanging from the lift line while skiing the adjacent slope. At the time, investigators had assumed it was normal maintenance work. The tourist had also mentioned seeing a single red flag fluttering near Tower 6, the exact tower where the harness had been found. Armed with this, the team returned to the site. The snow had receded slightly since the last visit, revealing more of the ground beneath the lift. That's when Jonas spotted something wedged in a crack in the ice, a small, rusted pulley wheel, broken clean in half. It matched the type used in portable hoist systems for hauling gear. Holbrook turned it over in his hand, feeling the rough edge where the metal had fractured. This wasn't resort-issued equipment. The case file thickened but still lacked the most important pieces, the couple's remains or their full gear. Without them, it was speculation built on fragments, but the discovery of the pulley changed the tone of the investigation. "This isn't just a missing persons case anymore," Mara told Holbrook quietly as they hiked back to the base. "It's a crime scene. 20 years old, but still a crime scene." That night, Holbrook sat alone in his office, the mountain dark outside his window. On the desk in front of him lay the harness, the thermos, the bag fragment, and the pulley. 4 objects, each with its own unanswered question. The harness asked, why was it clipped to a foreign cable? The thermos asked, why was it left behind if someone took them? The bag fragment asked, how did it end up in that crevice? The pulley asked, who installed it? And what did they haul? Outside, the wind rattled the lift cables, the sound carrying down the slope like a whisper. Holbrook closed his eyes, imagining the chairs swaying in the cold. Somewhere above Tower 6, the truth still clung to the steel, waiting to be pulled down. 2 weeks after the pulley was recovered, the mountain weather broke. 3 straight days of clear skies and stable temperatures. Holbrook knew they couldn't waste the window. If they were ever going to check the terrain beneath Tower 6, it had to be now, before the next storm buried everything again. The area below the tower was infamous ammo. The resort's maintenance staff. The slope dropped away at an angle so steep it seemed to fall straight into the valley floor. Jagged rock spines jutted out like teeth, and deep fissures cut through the snowpack, some of them big enough to swallow a person whole. Holbrook called in Jonas and 2 other climbers, Dana Kessler and Mateo Cruz, both veterans of high-angle rescues. Mara insisted on coming too. "If we find something," she said, "I want to see it firsthand." They started their descent just after sunrise. The lift towers loomed overhead, their cables groaning in the morning breeze. The steel lattice of Tower 6 was coated in frost, each step on the narrow service ladder slick with ice. From the maintenance platform, they clipped into ropes and leaned back over the edge, beginning the slow, deliberate drop. Jonas took the lead, scanning the rock face for anything that didn't belong. At about 40 feet down, he paused and called up, "I've got something." Holbrook's stomach tightened as he lowered himself alongside Jonas. Wedged into a narrow ledge was a tangled mess of rope, sun-bleached to a dirty white. It wasn't lift cable, it was climbing rope, tied off to a rusted anchor bolt hammered into the rock. The knot was sloppy, rushed. Beside the rope lay a small metal object half buried in ice. Jonas chipped it free with his pick. It was a locking carabiner, the kind used in mountaineering, but this one was twisted nearly in half, as if it had been caught under extreme force. Mateo, still above them, shouted down, "There's more below you!" They continued another 20 feet, where the slope angled inward to a shallow overhang. Here, the snow thinned, revealing bare rock. That's where Dana spotted it, a shape jutting out horizontally, wrapped in shredded nylon fabric. Holbrook's boots scraped the ledge as he swung closer. The object was about the length of his arm, rounded at one end, flattened at the other. His mind struggled to place it until he saw the faded logo stamped into the metal, Alpine Star Equipment Co. It was the footrest from a chairlift seat. But this one had been sawn clean from its frame. The cut edges were smooth, the work of a blade, not weather damage. Holbrook felt the back of his neck prickle. Someone had removed the footrest on purpose. Dana peeled away some of the nylon, revealing more metal struts and a few strands of upholstery foam. The whole assembly had been crammed into the ledge, out of sight from above. "Why hide this?" Mara muttered. Jonas glanced up at the tower looming overhead. "Because if you pull a seat off the line, everyone will know it's missing, but if you hide it down here—" Holbrook didn't answer. He was already thinking about the rope, the pulley, the harness, all the pieces lining up. If someone had lowered the Grangers off the lift, this was how they'd done it. Remove a seat to make room, rig a pulley, lower them out of sight, and stash the evidence before anyone could come looking. They bagged the footrest and began the slow climb back up. By the time they reached the maintenance platform, the sun was high, glaring off the snow. Holbrook's radio crackled. It was the base team, saying they'd found something else. Back on solid ground, Mara led the way to where two techs were kneeling beside a snowbank not far from the tower. One of them was holding a small, rectangular object wrapped in cloth. They unwrapped it to reveal a pocket-sized leather notebook, the kind hikers often carry. The cover was cracked and stiff, and the edges of the pages were warped from moisture. Holbrook flipped it open carefully. The first few pages were blank, but halfway through, faint writing emerged, smeared, but legible enough to make out words. The handwriting was neat, looping. March 11th. Lifts stopped again. We're not moving. Silas says he hears something above us, like chains dragging. I told him it's probably just wind, but I don't know. It's so quiet now, I can't see anyone on the chairs ahead or behind, just empty. The air feels wrong. The entry ended there. Holbrook closed the notebook slowly. It was signed at the bottom with a single initial, E. "Elara," Mara whispered. The team stood in silence. The little book felt heavier than its weight. It was the first unshakable proof that the Grangers had been alive and aware in the moments before they vanished, and that whatever happened wasn't quick. Back at the station, the notebook was photographed, dried, and stored alongside the other evidence. Holbrook read the entry again and again, each time catching new shivers of dread. The mention of chains dragging bothered him the most. The lift's normal operation wouldn't produce that sound, not unless something was physically being hauled along the line. That night, as wind rattled the station's windows, Holbrook stood over the evidence table, tracing the sequence of events in his head. The Grangers board the lift. Somewhere near Tower 6, the lift stops. Someone on the maintenance platform above attaches a pulley and rope. The seat is removed, the couple lowered to the ledge. The footrest is cut away, hidden. The harness, rope, and pulley disappear into the cliff. But the question that clawed at him was the same one that had haunted this case for years. Where were they taken after that? The valley below was a wilderness of ravines, caves, and abandoned mining tunnels. If the Grangers had been lowered into that maze, finding them now, after all these years, would be like searching for a shadow in a storm. And yet, as Holbrook switched off the office light, he knew they had no choice. The mountain had kept its secret for long enough. 2 days later, the team was back under the shadow of Tower 6, this time armed with more than climbing ropes and caution. Holbrook had requested ground pin, he trading radar from the county search and rescue unit. If the Grangers had been taken into the ravines below, they needed to know exactly where to start looking. The radar scan painted a strange picture of the slope. Clusters of voids deep beneath the snowpack, their shapes too regular to be natural caves. Mateo, crouched over the monitor, traced one long, dark corridor with a gloved finger. "That's not a fissure," he said. "That's man-made." Dana's head tilted. "Mining tunnel?" Holbrook nodded slowly. This part of the range had been riddled with mining claims in the late 1800s, most abandoned after the gold veins ran dry. A few shafts were sealed, but most were simply forgotten, hidden under decades of snow and rockfall. The entrance, Mateo pointed out, sat less than 200 feet down slope from the tower's base, an unassuming patch of shadow at the base of a cliff. By the time they reached it, the morning sun had shifted enough to illuminate the opening. It wasn't much to look at, a jagged arch of rock half blocked by ice and wind-blown debris. Holbrook had to dig out chunks of frozen earth just to squeeze inside. The air changed immediately. Outside, the cold was sharp and dry, Inside, it was damp and stale, carrying the metallic tang of rust. Their headlamps cut narrow beams through the darkness, catching the glint of iron rails half buried in silt. Jonas was the first to spot the rope. It dangled from a spike driven into the tunnel wall, its frayed end brushing the floor. Holbrook ran his hand along it. Nylon, weathered, but not ancient. This wasn't left over from the 1800s. Someone had been in here in the last few decades. They moved deeper, stepping over warped planks and rusted tools. The tunnel angled downward, the air growing heavier with every step. At one point the ceiling dropped so low they had to crouch. Then Dana froze, her light fixed on something ahead. At first it looked like another pile of debris. Snowmelt runoff that had trickled in and refrozen. But as they drew closer, shapes emerged from the ice. Fabric. Leather. Holbrook knelt and began clearing away the crusted frost. What emerged was a canvas rucksack, flattened and stiff, its straps twisted like rope. A torn luggage tag dangled from one buckle, but the ink was long gone. Mateo ran his beam over the wall above the pack and inhaled sharply. Holbrook, you need to see this. Carved into the rock were two letters. E.G. Elara Granger. Mara whispered from behind them. The letters were shallow but deliberate, the strokes uneven as if made with the tip of a knife. Below them, scratched into the rock in hurried, jagged lines, were three words. Not safe here. The air seemed to tighten around them. Holbrook took a step back, forcing his mind to keep moving. Bag it, he said, nodding at the rucksack. Everything stays intact for forensics. They pressed on, following the rails until the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. The floor here was a patchwork of ice and mud, and in the far corner, something metallic glimmered under a thin sheet of frost. It was a lantern, a heavy, brass-bodied model that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Holbrook lifted it, and the faint slosh inside told him it still held fuel. That meant it had been left here intentionally, ready for use. But it was what lay beside the lantern that made the room feel suddenly smaller. A pair of leather gloves, stiff with age, each with a name written in faded marker on the cuff. S. Granger. Mara turned away, covering her mouth. Holbrook set the gloves down gently, his thoughts racing. The Grangers had been here. At least one of them had been alive long enough to carve a warning into the wall, and whoever brought them here had left them with light and some supplies. But why? Theories clawed at him. Ransom gone wrong. Some twisted survival test, or something even darker. But before he could chase any of them, Jonas's voice echoed from Dew. "Eeper in the chamber." "There's another passage back here," he called. "Narrow, but it keeps going." Holbrook crouched to peer into the crack Jonas had found. The space beyond was barely wide enough for a single person, and the floor dropped sharply out of sight. A faint draft rose from the darkness below, carrying with it an odor that turned Holbrook's stomach. Damp earth, rot, and something metallic. He looked at Jonas. "We'll need more rope and a winch for this. No one goes down without backup." Jonas hesitated. "What if this is where they—" "Then it's waited this long," Holbrook cut in. "It can wait until we do it right." They retraced their steps, the weight of what they'd found pressing harder with each turn of the rails. By the time they emerged into daylight, the mountain air felt too sharp, too loud. Holbrook glanced back at the dark mouth of the tunnel. It was hard not to imagine Elara carving those letters into the stone, her hands shaking, the echo of her voice swallowed by the earth. That night, as snow began to fall again, he laid the gloves and rucksack side by side on the evidence table. Beside them sat the notebook from the previous find and the bent carabiner from the ledge. Piece by piece the picture was forming, but it was still missing its center. Whatever was down that narrow shaft would be the next piece, and Holbrook had the sinking feeling it would either answer every question they had or raise ones they weren't ready to face. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the slope under Tower 6 glazed in fresh ice. Holbrook's team returned with a portable winch, extra harnesses, and more lights than they thought they'd need. No one spoke much as they unpacked. Even Jonas, normally full of commentary, kept his voice low. The narrow opening gaped in the rock like a second mouth. Holbrook had slept badly the night before, dreams looping back to the carved letters E.G. and the way the gloves had lain, palms up, as if waiting for someone to take them. Mateo fed the rope through his belay device and lowered the first light stick into his shaft. It clinked and bounced for several feet before coming to rest, casting a weak green halo below. 10, maybe 12 meters, he guessed. Looks like it opens up at the bottom. Holbrook went first. The walls scraped his shoulders the whole way down, rock pressing close enough to hear his own breathing echo. The smell intensified the deeper he went, an earthy damp overlaid with something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. When his boots touched bottom, his light swept over a chamber that was nothing like the mine tunnel above. This space was natural, carved by water and time, but altered by human hands. Crude timbers reinforced one wall, and in the center of the room, suspended from a pair of cables stretched between rock faces, was something that stopped him cold: a chairlift seat. It was the same model as the one still running above, but stripped of its cushions, the paint worn to bare metal. The cables disappeared into dark recesses on either side of the chamber, as if they'd once connected to the main line but had been severed. Jonas descended next, his boots crunching on loose gravel. What the hell? He tilted his light up toward the cables. This is part of the system. But how does it even get down here? Holbrook circled the seat slowly. One of the safety bars was bent at an awkward angle, and dangling from it was a single climbing harness, faded red nylon, frayed at the edges. The leg straps were twisted as if yanked in haste. A tag inside the waistband read simply, E. Granger. Dana's voice came from behind him, sharper than she meant. So they brought it down here? For what? Holbrook didn't answer. His beam picked out scuff marks on the floor leading away from the chairlift toward a shadowed alcove. The tracks ended abruptly at a mound of loose rock. He knelt, brushing away the smaller stones until his fingers closed around something smooth. When he pulled it free, the chamber seemed to contract around them. It was a wedding ring, gold, dulled by time, its surface nicked and scratched. Inside the band, barely legible, was an inscription: S.E. 1987. Holbrook turned it over in his palm, feeling the cold bite of the metal. They were here, he said quietly. Both of them. Mateo set up the winch to haul the chairlift seat upward for forensic work, but Holbrook's eyes kept drifting back to the mound of rock. Something about the way it had been piled looked deliberate, not the work of a cave-in. "Help me clear this," he said. They worked in silence, each rock scraping against the next until a narrow gap appeared at the base. Holbrook eased his light through and caught the glint of fabric. "Hold it," he said, and pushed one last stone aside. The gap revealed a small recess in the wall, no deeper than an arm's length. Inside lay a tightly rolled bundle wrapped in oilcloth, the kind used to keep out damp. He pulled it free, the fabric crackling as it unfolded. Inside were 3 items: a small leather-bound notebook, pages warped but still legible, a rusted pocket knife, and a photograph. The photograph was black and white, creased from folding. It showed Silas and Elara in heavy winter coats, seated on a chairlift, smiling at the camera. The background was pure white snow, no sign of the steep wooded drop below. On the back, in smudged pencil, someone had written, "Last Ride." Holbrook stared at the words until they blurred. The notebook was filled with tight, hurried handwriting. The first few entries described the couple's trip: the cold, the beauty of the mountains, the way the chairlift seemed to float above the world. Then, mid-page, the tone shifted. "Saw something under the cables today. Thought it was a shadow, but it moved. Operator says weather's coming in, but I don't believe him. Silas agrees we should leave tomorrow. They wouldn't let us off. Took us on another run. Downward, not the main line." The last entry was dated the day too. "Hey, vanished. We're below the snow line now. It's dark. We're not alone." Holbrook closed the notebook, the air in the chamber feeling suddenly heavier. Whatever had happened to the Grangers had been orchestrated, and it had involved more than just a malfunctioning lift. He slipped the items into an evidence bag, then looked up at the cables vanishing into darkness. "These connect somewhere," he said. "Somewhere no one's found yet." Jonas shifted uneasily. "You think it's still there? Whoever did this?" Holbrook didn't answer. Instead, he ran a hand along the frayed harness strap, imagining Elara's last moments in it. The mountain had kept it secret for decades, but the steel in his voice was final when he spoke. Not anymore. By the time the chairlift seat was hoisted up from the shaft, the light outside had thinned into the pale gray of approaching snow. Holbrook stayed below, tracing the cables with his beam. They didn't end at the chamber. They tunneled on, sagging slightly under their own weight, into a crevice that seemed impossibly narrow for human passage. Mateo's voice came from above. "We've got enough for the lab. You coming up?" "Not yet." Holbrook eased sideways into the crevice, shoulders brushing damp stone. The floor angled upward, then flattened into a rough, hand-carved path that ran alongside the cables. The air grew colder, tinged with the faint metallic smell of machinery that had been dormant for years. He moved slowly, boots crunching on grit, until the path ended in a sheer drop. Below, in a black void, hung the rest of the chairlift system, a ghost line hidden beneath the main route. There were 6 more seats in sight. All were stripped bare like the first, their metal frames pitted with rust. Most swayed gently in the draft from some unseen opening, but one seat was different. It carried weight. Holbrook's light caught on a buttress, handle lashed to the safety bar. An old canvas pack, edges rotted, its color lost to mildew and time. A length of frayed rope dangled from it, swaying in the cold air. He felt his pulse quicken. There was no way down from here without proper rigging, and even then the angle would be dangerous. He marked the spot with chalk before heading back. When they returned the next day, the weather had turned brutal. Snow hammered the ridge line and wind clawed at their jackets. But Holbrook wasn't about to wait. He and Mateo rigged a double line, lowering themselves toward the loaded seat. Up close, the pack was worse than it looked from above. The fabric crumbled at his touch, releasing a musty scent that clung to his gloves. He worked carefully, easing it open. Inside was a mess of waterlogged cloth, bits of paper fused together, and something solid. A camera. It was an old 35mm model, dented, the lens cracked. Holbrook slipped it into an evidence pouch without comment, but when he turned the pack over, something else fell out. A scarf. It was wool, deep burgundy in color, though much of it had faded to a brownish gray. The ends were knotted, as if tied hastily, and one corner was stiff with what looked like dried blood. Dana's voice was barely audible over the wind. "We have to go." Back at base, the forensic team worked through the night. The camera was too corroded to run film normally, but a specialist managed to develop several frames. Most were black or blurred, but one image stood out. Silas and Elara, seated on a chairlift, but not smiling this time. Elara's face was turned toward something beyond the frame, her eyes wide. Silas had one arm around her and the other gripping the safety bar hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Behind them, in the distance, a dark shape clung to the cables. Not another chair, but something larger, with angular lines that didn't match any known lift equipment. Holbrook stared at the photo until he could see nothing else. The path of the hidden cables was mapped the next day. They led from the shaft to a secondary stat, iron buried deep inside the mountain. Its entryway collapsed decades earlier. Inside, they found signs of human presence, old fuel drums, scattered tools, a cot with rotted blankets, but there was no sign of the Grangers, alive or dead. In one corner, partially buried under debris, was a metal sign. It was the same faded green as the main resort signage, but the lettering was different. Service line, authorized personnel only. Someone had painted over the last 3 words with thick black strokes. The resort's oldest maintenance records mentioned the service line only once in 1964, before the current owners took over. No one could explain why it had been sealed, or why it had been reactivated in 1987, the year Silas and Elara vanished. Holbrook knew they were close to the truth, but close wasn't enough. Without remains, without proof, the case would remain in the same limbo it had occupied for 35 years. The final image burned into his mind wasn't from the photograph or the shaft, but from something the drone operator mentioned casually as they packed up. "When I first saw the harness hanging below the cables, I thought it was just wind rocking it. But the sway, it wasn't random. It was like someone was still sitting there." That night Holbrook dreamed of the hidden line, swaying in the dark. The wind howled through the chamber, and the cables sang their thin, metallic note. From somewhere deep in the mountain came the faintest creak, like weight shifting on an old seat. He woke with the sound still in his ears. And for the first time since the case began, Holbrook wondered if the mountain had ever truly let the Grangers go.